Welcome to the Yeoman Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Graham. With me today is Emily Hamilton of Mercatus Institute. Excited to have Emily with me. We're going to talk a lot about housing, urbanism, housing policy, an area that she has been focused on in a really great way for more than half a decade, really probably 7 years or so with Mercatus. Her career at Mercatus, I think, began 10 years ago, and I'm going to get her to share a little bit about that. Emily, welcome.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It's great to talk with you.
So we have seen a lot happen over the last decade in terms of housing policy, transportation policy, urban policy. You've been paying attention to all of those things. Before we go back in time a little bit, can you tell me about some of the really recent things you've been working on? I think maybe this month, the beginning of this month, you testified for a congressional subcommittee. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. Over the time that I've been working on housing and land use issues, I've gotten a lot more optimistic about the potential for reform. We're seeing just more and more interest from policymakers across the political spectrum in making it possible to build more housing in the places where people want to live at more affordable prices. Mm-hmm. And when I first started getting interested in this issue, it just struck me as something that's so politically difficult because you have the majority of the country are homeowners who just don't want to see any sort of change in their own neighborhoods. So when you have these local rules that make it hard to build housing, it's hard to see a way out of it. But I've been definitely proven wrong. There's been a lot of interest in reforming this issue at every level of government.
I say, well, you say you've been proven wrong. I find that incredibly ironic because the work that you and your colleagues have been doing at Mercatus is a huge reason why that sentiment has changed so much in the last decade. I say this over and over again, but when I got my start in the world of land use, real estate development, building, in a professional capacity, which was 30 years ago, I was, like you said, just really saddened by the state of our regulatory environment and how difficult it made it for people to build really wonderful places where people want to live. And yet, while it still remains incredibly difficult and there's an enormous amount of work to be done, a difference now versus then is exactly what you said. So many people want to see it changed, which was not the case a long time ago. So you just presented before Congress. What was that about?
Yeah, well, I think that the farther we get away geographically from any individual land use decision, the more agreement we see that there needs to be more housing supply in all kinds of different places and that the policies that are preventing that housing supply are a problem. So in this case, the Republican-led subcommittee had me up to talk about regulatory barriers in land use and building codes to providing more housing. But I've had similar requests from Democrats, and the conversations really don't go any differently. Maybe a little bit of different emphasis on the why it's important to have rules that enable more people to have homes in the places where they want to live. But there's really broad spread agreement that that's what we need to see. And it's maybe a rare area of real agreement on the problem and the solutions in our politics today.
It's pretty exciting to me. Whether you see it from a Democratic mayor or a Republican governor, when they talk about this issue, at least when informed elected officials are talking about this issue, you could not tell which party they're from. They're saying the same kinds of things, which is exciting. Also, I have to admit that normally whenever I hear widespread agreement between both parties, I get real worried, like or something like that. But this is an area where I'm like, yes, finally it's happening. So and y'all have been doing a tremendous amount of work in this regard. I'm kind of when maybe we break it down and talk about and you tell me, I think there's probably a couple areas we could talk about. One is on the zoning side of things, and you could slice this a number of ways. There's the zoning side, and then there's building code reform as well. Can we start talking about the building code reform that we're doing now?
Sounds great.
Which is maybe something we chatted about a little bit before, is on single stair reform, those sorts of things. Can you describe some of that sort of stuff that's happening?
Yeah. Well, thanks for your vote of confidence in our work. One place where we've seen a lot of interest from state and local policymakers is on changing some of the building code rules that are really different in the United States and Canada compared to other high-income countries around the world. One of the really big ticket differences is that generally mid-rise and taller buildings in the United States and Canada are required to have 2 staircases for any residential or any type of building. In the US for buildings over 3 stories. In Canada, I believe it's generally for any building that's 2 stories or higher. If it's not a single family house, it's going to have 2 staircases to exit that building. And it's not so much the staircases themselves that are a big problem, although they do, of course, take up space and add cost. But what this leads to is development that tries to spread out the cost of having these staircases over a long corridor of what's called, among architects, a double-loaded corridor that has apartments just on either side, like a hotel room, but it's an apartment building where we have a long corridor and most units in the building only have windows on one side in order to open out onto this corridor that connects 2 staircases. In turn, this means that our apartments generally don't have as much light as they might in another country if this staircase requirement weren't in place. And it also means that apartment buildings usually can't be built on small pieces of land because developers are going to look for a big piece of land where they can have a long corridor connecting these 2 staircases. And this leads to a really different built environment than what we might see in a country like Germany, which is generally a favorite among building code nerds, where you see small apartment buildings connected together with attached walls, with a small number of units within each building on each floor surrounding a single staircase. I think many people in the housing reform world in the U.S. this really wasn't an issue on their radar until one architect, Mike Eliason, out of Seattle, who had previously worked in Germany, started posting online about this staircase issue. And then just about 4 years later, we've seen 11 states and at least 3 cities taking efforts to reform their building codes to address some of the problems with the 2 staircase requirement.
Yeah, unless you're a designer, you've really paid attention to this topic, and even probably designers, it's sort of like the fish don't recognize the water they're swimming in. It has an enormous impact on the floor plan that you can create. And then also, even as just a regular person who experiences architecture, you might go these beautiful historic places that you might go into, and you see you walk into a certain setting and how it is and how the stairs are part of the architecture, and there's, and I don't think I don't know that the single stair reform is addressing this in particular, but the way that people would interact with stairs in older buildings is really, really different and affects the whole design of the building. And it drives up the cost in this huge way, not just from the floor plan perspective, but then there's the fire safety stuff on top of that. Like they're building when you watch a building under construction, you're seeing these two stairways emerge first that are giant towers of cinder block, and then the building is built around that. It's a huge amount of cost.
Yeah. And then additionally, by having more space dedicated to circulation, so that long corridor and the staircases, then that also means you have to have more cladding, more exterior walls, more just everything that adds to the cost of building in a way that might not be obvious.
Who are some of the people? I think Stephen Smith has worked on this topic in a lot, hadn't he, with elevators and stairways, and then in North Carolina, real estate developer Jason, I'm blanking on Jason's last name, we'll link to both these guys' work, talked about kind of the fire safety. Like we have a lot of things that are intended to make a safer environment, or at least that's the stated reason, is to create a safer environment. But there's really not any evidence at all that they make environments safer. Is that right?
Right. If we look at just raw statistics across high-income countries, the U.S. does not have a good fire safety outcomes compared to a lot of other high-income countries. Stephen Smith has done some great research with folks at Pew, looking specifically at single stair buildings and their fire safety outcomes. And in the cities where they have been allowed for a long time in the US, New York City and Seattle are exceptions to the two staircase requirement. Those two cities have long allowed somewhat taller multifamily buildings to be built with just one staircase, and they have identified 0 deaths looking at all of the fire safety data from New York City and Seattle over decades. They've identified 0 deaths in a single stair multifamily building related to the staircases.
Yeah. I think about trying to make this topic like more relatable to lay people who aren't in the industry. Like most everybody cooks, prepares food or prepares meals. And I think about it this way, like imagine what our food the cost of our food and the quality of our food, if there were the same amount of regulatory oversight applied to the preparation of a meal that there is to the creation of a building. And I know those are two different things, and one lasts, or should last for forever, or a really long time, and the other's meant to be enjoyed just once. But like it would be literally impossible for a regular person. This touches a little bit on the yeoman topic. For a regular person to just go out and prepare a meal, if you had to submit your plan, if there was standards that you had to apply to for every meal you were going to do, you had to pay a small fee to apply to get permission to build the meal. After you started building, people would come, or after you started cooking, people would come and inspect your preparation throughout the process. You weren't allowed for ingredients to touch, and the size of your plate was regular, all these sorts of things. And you can imagine, like, well, if that were the case, then the only way we would be able to get food would be if giant, really specialized companies were in charge of all food creation. That's what we would end up with. And that's a bit what we have in the building industry with the elevator stair related issues being just one of a great many things that affect it, and one of hopefully, to that said, like, there's a lot of reform happening. So describe what's happening now. People are becoming aware of this issue. It's maybe one of the big things or one of the small things, seemingly small things that could change, that could have a big impact. Who's changing? Like what's out there that's changing?
Well, on the building code front, what we're mostly seeing so far is that state policymakers are beginning to direct their statewide agencies that create their state-specific building codes to begin looking into this issue and begin seeing about the feasibility of making it possible to build taller single-stair buildings while maintaining fire safety. So we're not at the stage yet where we can point to like buildings that are being built with a single stair that would have required two previously. And we're, for the most part, not at the point yet where we can point to new places where it's already legal to build taller single stair buildings, with a couple of exceptions. But I think one place where we can really see this snowballing of awareness about housing policies that are standing in the way of housing supply is with accessory dwelling unit policy.
Yeah, right.
Accessory dwelling units are secondary units generally at the site of a single family house, that are usually have their own kitchen and bathroom. They could be something like a backyard cottage that a homeowner rents out, or a basement apartment, or a mother-in-law suite. And prior to zoning being adopted in much of the U.S. about 100 years ago, I don't think people thought of these units as like any sort of special thing. It was just a way that people used their property to provide housing.
It never would have occurred to our founders a need to put in the Bill of Rights that be able to rent out their garage apartment.
Exactly.
Something that need later, like, of course, like no one would ever doubt that would be something we need to put in the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Apparently it was. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
It was in the fit, like actually, like I guess the question of zoning and whether or not that's constitutional, which maybe we'll touch on that a little bit.
Sure.
But like in like 102 years ago, before the Euclid decision, there probably weren't a lot of people out there thinking, my municipality should come in and tell my neighbors whether or not they should be able to rent out a room or have a second kitchen in their house.
Right.
On people's radar screen.
Right. Yeah. Oftentimes
it's changed, right? Like from municipality to municipality. Is that and some state level stuff too? Can you describe some of that?
Yeah. So way back in 1982, California became the first state to broadly legalize accessory dwelling units. California has been a real leader in statewide land use reform. And I think this is basically because they had created such a severe problem of making it nearly impossible to build new housing across the whole state. Even dating back to the 80s, this was a problem in California, where it had not started becoming a problem in much of the country.
And would you say like that problem arose, at least in part, because the difficulty property owners had in securing building permits to build new things? And so am I right in thinking maybe they viewed it as maybe politically expedient, like we could enable accessory dwelling units and ease some of the housing tension or ease some of the shortage?
Exactly. Yeah. I think they correctly identified accessory dwelling units as kind of the easiest place to put a small limit on localities' authority to prevent housing construction. In California, as in every state, localities get their authority to implement zoning ordinances and regulate land use because the state delegates that authority to them. And in 1982, policymakers in California stepped in and said, wow, it looks like we've delegated a little bit too much authority to make it really hard to build housing across the state. We're going to put a tiny little guardrail in this one area. And that law had basically no effect because it left open a lot of loopholes for localities to continue banning accessory dwelling units for all practical purposes if they wanted to. But starting in 2016, California state policymakers came back and began closing those loopholes and making it practically feasible for homeowners across much of the state to start adding these units if they want to. And now, several years later, we've seen at least 15 states broadly legalize accessory dwelling units. And learning from the experience of California and other states that were earlier movers in this area, some of the more recent accessory dwelling unit laws at the state level are addressing all of these loopholes in their first ADU bill. So we're seeing an improvement in the quality of this legislation from the perspective of making it possible to actually build these units.
They're coming out of the door, and it's working. It's enabling instead of kind of performatively so, as in the early '80s in California. Is that right?
Exactly.
On that I've thought about. I think there's tension among. I find it ironic that left-leaning people when left-leaning people tend to be supportive of exclusionary zoning type things, and when right-leaning people tend to be oppositional to individuals' rights to determine what they're going to do with their own property. And I find that those things happen a lot. And I guess maybe it's the inverse of the heartening agreement we're seeing from people generally on the left and the right about re-enabling property owners to do more things with their property. There has been an inverse of that for the long time, where there's been the left and the right has been on the same page about preventing people from doing things. And it's nice to see the state step in. Normally I am a big subsidiarist, I would say, where I'd like the most local to have the authority of it. And I've always viewed the most local as the person themselves, like the property owner. Like I should have domain over what happens there. And we got into this weird situation following particularly the Euclid Supreme Court decision in 1926, but others, where the federal government said, hey, municipalities are able to if the states allow them, municipalities are able to zone property, and transferred that right from individuals to really the state, who delegated it to the municipality. Is that the right? Am I describing that correctly, how that happened?
Yes. And you're exactly right that while pro-housing deregulatory sentiment is shared among lots of people on the left and on the right, anti-housing regulatory support is equally cross-partisan. Mm-hmm. But I like how you phrase that issue of subsidiarity, because when states are stepping in to set limits on local zoning authority, another way of looking at that is expanding property rights for the individuals across the state. So this method of protecting property rights in a way like bypasses the locality to expand decision making at the level of the property owner.
Mm-hmm. What was it? I can't remember offhand, but Montana, you can maybe describe, I'm sure you can describe better than me what Montana's done, but I remember their campaign, and it was essentially, they had these, all I saw was the door knockers, and it was like a rugged Western, cowboy theme or something like, property owners need to have property rights, or something like, none of this California stuff where people don't have property rights. We want you to be able to use your land as you see fit. And that was more or less the campaign that they ran in a very conservative state, which would be a different framing than a campaign that might have been run in California, but towards the same end. Can you describe what's happened in California in the last maybe 2 years ago?
Yeah, in Montana, right?
In Montana, I'm sorry, yeah.
In let's see, I think ahead of the 2023 legislative session, Governor Gianforte made it a big priority to address housing supply and housing affordability. Montana, up until maybe the mid 2010s, was a relatively affordable state. Certainly it had its expensive pockets, but across the board, it was more affordable than the nation as a whole. But partly because of remote work, partly because of whatever reasons, for people wanting to move into
flights from California.
Yeah. Really beautiful state. Demand for housing skyrocketed in a way that would have increased prices regardless of policy. When you have that huge influx of people moving in because of remote work, because of the pandemic, leading people to want to leave the cities where their jobs might have been previously located, you saw a huge increase in demand and serious problems for Montana renters and anybody who needed to change their housing situation for whatever reason, who were just shut out of what had been a relatively affordable market. And following Gianforte's leadership, the legislature passed several bills that have expanded property owners' rights to build housing, including legalizing accessory dwelling units, allowing duplexes in single-family zones, allowing multifamily construction in commercial zones, as well as some important permit streamlining work. And the Frontier Institute, which is a libertarian think tank in Montana, did a fantastic messaging job, like those door knockers that you point to, of messaging this as an end to California style zoning in Montana, which really is true. I mean, California was a pioneer in developing exclusionary zoning and permit approval processes.
The timing of the development of that state, like when it became, like it was largely happened following 1926, or so they were, a lot of these cities were beginning from scratch, and probably Atlanta maybe is similar to that in a way,
right?
With zoning, whereas so many of other places were developed prior to zoning existing at all. Can you describe, like, I know Mercatus has been supportive, like crucially supportive for a lot of leaders and being able to articulate the why and building a compelling argument for it, or educating legislators on why this is a good thing or how to approach it or whatever. Can you just, like, y'all were supportive of the efforts in Montana, as I recall. Is that right?
Yeah, I worked on the governor's what was called the Housing Task Force, which I think worked really well in the Montana context. They have a part-time legislature that only meets every other year, and really minimal staff resources for the legislature. So in that context, I think the task force was helpful, and in a position where the task force's ideas would get picked up by the legislators, because they didn't have, a bunch of staffers who could do the analysis of what are other states doing, what's working where. And one thing that we try to do at Mercatus is provide case studies of successful land use or permitting reforms that have made really obvious differences to housing supply. So not some reforms that might just look good on paper but aren't actually changing the world, but reforms where you can look at a chart of housing before and after and see a huge difference in the feasibility of getting housing built in the area where the reform applies. And in the past several years, we've seen a huge uptake in interest from state policymakers in particular. So we've tried to package some of the lessons from those case studies in a way where state policymakers can say, I know I want to do something about the difficulty of building housing in my state. What are some ideas? And present that in a way that can make what we know about housing reform very accessible to that audience.
A related significant reform that I know you're really familiar with and involved with is Houston's reform, which their big reforms maybe began happening a dozen years or so ago. Can you describe kind of what the status quo had been for the city of Houston, how it was different than what we think of normally as zoning, and how it's effectively similar, if your take on it in general, and then what has happened in Houston, and to your point about like there's some big success stories we can point to now, and maybe describe how that city has changed.
Yeah, like a lot of market urbanists, I'm really interested in Houston. It's the only big U.S. city that doesn't have use-based zoning. So most U.S. cities have specific zones where only single-family residential is allowed or only retail is allowed. Houston doesn't have that type of regulation. But nonetheless, they do have some land use regulations that would typically appear in a zoning ordinance if the city did have a zoning ordinance. And one of those is minimum lot size requirements. And prior to 1998, the city of Houston had a 5,000 square foot minimum lot size requirement across the whole city, which is from an East Coast perspective, pretty small already. Like in New England suburbs, you can find 2-acre minimum lot sizes all over the place, which is like 8 times as large as Houston's. But or more than that, 16 times, I think. but they reduced that minimum lot size requirement in Houston within what's called their I-610 loop, so within the center of the city, down to 1,400 square feet in 1998. And that's a level of density of minimum lot size where it's feasible to build something that looks much more like a townhouse than a typical U.S. single-family house. And this was transformative.
And what year was that?
1998. Especially in some of their older neighborhoods, maybe most notably Rice Military, which is a prime located neighborhood near the university, near job centers, and where there were not HOAs or private deed restrictions protecting, say, 1950s detached single-family houses that had been built there. And that reform really transformed the neighborhood with small lot single-family houses that doubled or tripled the number of households that could be built on that land. Mm-hmm. And then as a result of the success of the 1998 reform, policymakers expanded it in 2013 to cover the entire city. And we've seen a lot of uptake of small lot development outside the I-610 loop as a result of that later reform. And in total, about 80,000 small lot houses have been built in Houston as a result of first the 1998 reform and then the 2013 expansion.
And how has that impacted, how has Houston done affordability-wise relative to other major cities?
It's the most affordable large Sunbelt metro in terms of how median house price relative to median income. San Antonio, by other metrics, might look more affordable than Houston, but it's certainly way up there in terms of most affordable large cities. And when you account for the level of growth in jobs and population that it's accommodated in recent decades, it's even more impressive that it's stayed an affordability success story.
Houston as a sometimes real estate developers, sometimes pursuing rezonings. Houston has always been the people's idea of Houston as a place that has no zoning has always been frustrated me, because they're like, oh, well, Houston's the only city without zoning. And look at it. It's got terrible traffic and it's got the worst sprawl. Like, unless you have zoning, you're going to have all these things. And I'm like, that's not true. It doesn't have exclusionary use zoning, but for a long, long time, it required by law everything to be really spread out. And, and they have huge infrastructure investments and car-oriented infrastructure on top of that. So that's why you have those things. It has zoning probably it's still to a degree, had zoning by another name, but it was still zoning. But those reforms have been huge. Like, and I thought it happened more recently than that, but 25, what are we saying now? 28 years ago is when all that started. Is that right?
Yes. But the 2013 reform does apply to more land than the initial one.
Outside of that circle. And the net effect for, I guess, is sort of, as people who like to see it possible for people to build more. Like, it's easy for us to stop at that. It's like, that's good because people were able to build more, and because there's more affordability and those sorts of things. But there's a broader impact for people who don't care about that, or who want housing, who benefit from housing, like existing property owners who benefit from housing remaining unaffordable indirectly, in the short term, because their home price goes up more. It's incredibly difficult to have a thriving community, like a real community, without places for people to live. And Houston's able to, better address that than what would be a peer city of Houston, you think? Like, that's a tale of two cities type thing. What would be a city that went in another direction?
Good question. I mean, in terms of major cities with the most exclusionary zoning, I would point to San Francisco or LA or Boston, but they all have huge differences, besides zoning from Houston.
Yeah. So there's a lot happening on the municipal level, city by city, Houston being an example of that. On the state level, Montana, California, what are some other states that are I should have mentioned on the city level, Minneapolis too is a big success story there. I'm thinking Seattle, but maybe I'm confusing Seattle and Portland.
I would say both have had some important.
It's like so far away from me. I'm like, it's kind of the same place.
Yeah, Pacific Northwest.
That's up there.
Yeah. All of the West Coast states have done big things at both the state and local level. Again, because of the severe housing shortage that their policies created over previous decades. Some of the other states that are maybe a little bit more surprising, where we've seen big interest in housing policy, are Colorado, another Mountain West state that's had more recent serious affordability challenges. Governor Polis has made this a big priority. And a few bills have been introduced in Texas, even though its cities are generally some of the most supportive of growth. We're also seeing state policymakers there wanting to address things like ADUs or expanding the Houston small lot development approach to other cities across the state.
I feel like there's a moment in time when the governor of Virginia, Doug Borgham, do I have that right? He was talking about this issue, or at least I was hearing him talk about this issue. Is anything happening close there in your neck of the woods?
Well, in Virginia, we have Governor Youngkin.
Not Borgham.
He certainly has talked about the importance of housing supply and red tape standing in the way of housing construction, but we have been a laggard in terms of actually passing anything at the state level. Northern Virginia localities, as well as the city of Richmond and Charlottesville to an extent, have been good compared to maybe peer cities in terms of allowing multifamily construction in downtown transit accessible areas. But we have not seen much action at the state level yet.
Yeah, just rhetoric. So far.
Yes.
I guess it's got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Another one, I guess I'd love to talk to you a little bit about it, but a huge reform just happened in Cambridge.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is sort of enormous. Can you describe sort of the before and after for Cambridge?
Yeah, it's not a case that I'm super deeply familiar with, but Cambridge is, of course, a suburb of Boston that has a long history of severe housing undersupply. If we look at the extent to which land use regulations are preventing housing from being built, Boston is way up there in terms of just there's very minimal supply response in response to more people wanting to live in Boston. It's almost all prices increasing, pushing people who can no longer afford the high prices out of the region and replacing them with higher income people. But there's as in many of the places that we've been talking about, there's growing recognition at the state and local level in Massachusetts that this is causing huge problems for people. And the city of Cambridge adopted a major reform that basically replaced all of their previous zones, as I understand it, with a new regulation that applies almost across the whole city, allowing multifamily construction up to 6 stories on every lot. The city was previously built out with a lot of what are called triple deckers. So that's like a triplex that's vertical with 3 units stacked on top of each other, as well as some apartments and some less dense single family neighborhoods. But it's not, it's always been developed as a relatively dense place, but it's seen immense increase in housing demand, in part because of the universities that are there, as well as Boston's general very strong labor market. And so it's been very underbuilt, and hopefully this will lead to major new multifamily construction in Cambridge.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to make the comparison when people think like, 6 stories, that's like terrible. I'm like, yeah, it could be like Rome or Barcelona or the most beautiful parts of Paris. It would be legal to build the most beautiful parts of Paris in Cambridge. That would be terrifying, right? We wouldn't want that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's when I probably, as someone who has a strong bias toward beauty, this is probably something that I might give the Mercatus folks a hard time about, because y'all don't talk much about beauty, do you?
No, we're a bunch of economists, and our colleague who's been on your show, Charlie Gardner, he's a lawyer. So no, that's not a focus of ours, to say the least.
I do wonder how this. I just don't know. We'll see how it plays out. But we've gone from many cities and states have gone from an incredibly regulated environment for a long period of time, where to be able to operate, essentially the playing field is tilted toward, tends to be larger and better capitalized developers who have enough scale that they can deal with the regulatory burdens associated with building in place. So we go from kind of creating that sort of ecosystem over decades in a market to automatically liberalizing to an environment which is maybe something closer to what it should have been like all along, except we have a dynamic now where the building culture, the ecosystem that exists in those places is already dominated now by really, really large. They're large developers and builders are better equipped to immediately go in and take advantage of those opportunities. And I don't know if it's true or not, but I'll say that it is. But that these would tend to be kind of spreadsheet developers who are, they're financialized businesses, REITs or whatever, and like they tend not to be the ones investing heavily in beauty because it is not producing immediate, measurable, near-term returns, and the returns are maybe longer or maybe even more spiritual. But I wonder what happens in markets that are heavily regulated markets that are suddenly liberalized, and sort of who are the developers that are moving in and building things, and what are the types of things they're building that I like how Russ Roberts, probably others say, not everything that can be measured matters, and not everything that can be measured matters, and not everything that matters can be measured. And I wonder what happens in these markets that have had this, that have just changed automatically, and yet the talent pool, or the professionals who are there working on this, maybe all the opportunity that gets created in the immediate term is going to be captured by these big folks who figured out how to operate there. I don't know what do you see in Houston, like after all those things happen? Was giant developers who are building things, or do you have a bunch of yeoman developers going in there and making hay all of a sudden?
Well, I don't know the statistics about like market concentration of developers across cities. That's a really interesting question. But I do know that in Houston, we certainly see examples of yeoman developers, even contractors who went from remodeling kitchens or, doing whatever type of home improvement work under the opportunities created by the minimum lot size reduction, shifted their business to begin replacing a single family house with maybe two or three taller, skinnier houses.
It's a totally accessible project.
Yes.
Remodeling a house is actually not all that different than developing a 4-unit apartment.
Doesn't require a ton of capital or a ton of specialized knowledge beyond what they already had from the work that they were doing previously. And I don't think some of these folks would necessarily consider themselves developers. They're just, doing the projects as they see them that makes sense.
I have a good friend of mine, he has a partner or business partner, and on the side, they buy up buildings and renovate them and then operate them as, they own them for the long term, and they're landlords essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, you're a real estate developer. He's like, no, I'm not. I'm like, you're totally a real estate developer. That's what real estate developers do. It's like,
exactly.
Anytime anyone renovates their house, I'm like, you're a real estate developer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say that most of the small lot Houston townhouses meet some different standard of beauty as a result of being built by smaller people with a smaller, more granular approach to the business. Although maybe to me at least, some of the neighborhoods, like I mentioned, Rice Military inside the I-610 loop that's seen a ton of townhouse construction is a really interesting neighborhood where for the most part you can see two houses on 2,500 square foot lots replaced a single family house. So you have these pairs of identical or mirror image houses
like
all over the neighborhood, and lots of interesting design, certainly, like metal siding and.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of when, you'd be in an old town, you see three really cool houses that are exactly alike right next to each other, three sisters or whatever.
Yeah.
That's happened a lot. I would expect too, maybe I'm talking myself out of like this dislocation that would happen. But with a lot of the small lot opportunities are attractive to small developers, and they're unattractive to larger developers who are probably not even going to be interested in pursuing them. And then you would have a bit of instead of a few very large lots where there's really not much competition between developers, there's less competition for all kinds of things, price, but also beauty, and beauty and price are tied together. Imagine with lots of small lots. We saw this in the development of Ion, like one builder on one side of the street would feel very much in competition with the builder directly across the street. Even if they're both custom homes, they were competing with each other, and their crews were competing with each other because they could see each other's projects. And I'll never forget standing on my porch with my exterior trim crew, and they're trimming out my porch, and they were looking across the street at the Hortons porch, who they were under construction at the same time, both custom houses. This was in 1998, I guess. And my carpenters were looking over there at the other guys. And the Hortons house is beautiful, like totally beautiful. And my carpenters were like, butchers. Porch is going to be so much prettier than their porch. We're not going to let their porch outdo your porch. And there's an opportunity for that sort of thing to emerge when there's so many more players in an ecosystem, and instead of being dominated by a fewer larger folks.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think there's something to just the granularity that comes from small lot development, getting us a lot of the way there to a beautiful city. Like if we looked at Hanoi in Vietnam or Tokyo, their architecture maybe isn't what some people would consider beautiful. It's pretty basic for the most part, but you just have all of these very dense small lot developments that are all different, tons of visual interest, and really narrow lots with buildings either touching or right close to each other that, to my eye, provides so much dynamism and interest that I think it's beautiful, even if it's not maybe the level of architecture or craftsmanship that other people would think is.
It makes you really appreciate how powerful the urban form is. And you take like the most beautiful building one can do in terrible urbanism, and it just seems totally weird. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
But if you have a great urban environment, the creation of an outdoor room, these pleasant places that feel human scaled, you can do all kinds of different things in the architecture. Also, like the notion, and I gather in Asia, people are more appreciative of this, that we think of building, we think of it lasting kind of forever, but it's kind of the urbanism that lasts a long time. But the architecture is actually kind of transient. I've heard somewhere, I don't know who said this, but and I don't even know if it's true or not, but something like in a healthy city, in a vibrant city, something like 10% of everything will get redeveloped every year. Whatever it is, it's some portion. And it's a lot, it's probably bigger than 5%. and it's probably less than 20%, but that's a lot. That means all the time you're rebuilding these places, and the roads are going to matter. Where the roads are is going to matter a whole lot, and whether you can build to the street, those things will matter a whole lot more than what happens with any one individual building.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that in Japan, houses are generally much younger than they are in the U.S.
Are they, am I right in thinking they tend to be a depreciating asset?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. How is that? Like, what is different about that? Well, I guess there's some significant demographic differences from fertility rates and aging population or whatever. But I think that dynamic, that depreciation, how housing generally depreciates there, that's kind of been the thing in Japan for a long time. Is that right?
Yeah. There's certainly important demographic demand side factors, but on the supply side, they have much more liberal land use regulations than the typical, but then probably anywhere in the U.S. And
it's interesting because I'm not super familiar with, never been to Japan, but my preconception is it is a much more orderly and prescribed society, but certainly not from a land use perspective.
Yeah. They have, I believe, 6 zoning designations that are determined at the national level. And even the most restrictive one allows, I think, a floor area ratio of 1, which is rare to find allowed in a U.S. city. And it allows
for a layperson who doesn't have to study these sort of things. This is the amount of livable square foot relative to the size of the lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you have a 2,000 square foot lot in Japan, you can build at least in the most restrictive zone, a 2,000 square foot house.
So that would be a 2-story building that entirely covers half the lot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And these zones are additive. So anything that you can do in the least restrictive zone, you can also do in every other zone, and so on. And then local governments have a role in deciding where they're going to map these different zones, but it's just a much more permissive land use regulation environment in all kinds of different ways. And
that's, obviously Japan has, a decreasing population and aging population. So clearly that's putting downward pressure on houses. But they're very permissive with regard to what can be built. Those things lead to houses generally depreciating in value, right? Mm-hmm. And what I gather, they probably don't have like the mortgage income tax or the mortgage interest tax deduction.
I can't speak to housing finance in Japan. I don't know.
Yeah, that's not your area of specialty.
No.
So it seems to me that were I in the Mercatus office, I would just be running victory laps all the time. Like you've been making these arguments for a decade. You personally have been making these arguments for nearly that long, 7 years working on this. And in that time, it seems entirely different. The tenor of the conversation, lay people I know who don't have any reason to be paying attention to housing policy have a different attitude about housing. They have an attitude about housing policy, often very much like, yeah, we clearly need to stop, making it impossible for people to build things. And your work and your team's work there is huge. You've been a huge enabling force to policymakers, which has made it, which is now, I would say, is making it, beginning to make it easier for developers builders, regular people to build cool things. It's really outstanding. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Geoff. I think we do have a lot of reason for optimism, but there's also like the more progress that gets made, it reveals so many other things that need to happen. Like, for example, with the issue of single stair reform, that came to light in part because localities were making zoning changes that were going to be basically impossible to take advantage of without building code reform.
Is that what broadened y'all's interest from zoning to building code specifically?
Yeah, certainly in part. Yeah. That sometimes zoning change just points you to the need to reform the permitting process or the building code or, 15 other things. So while we can certainly point to lots of very promising local level reforms and state level reforms, I think we're still certainly not at the point where we can stop pushing on this issue. And in some cases, not even, what's that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. In some cases, not even at the point where we're seeing big effects in the market as a result of policy change. There's a lot of work that remains to be done in implementing some of these statewide laws at the local level and making sure that the right reforms have been done in the right place to really solve the housing supply problem.
Yeah, well, that's much better said than the way I put it. I don't want to take celebrate prematurely. The thing that is just so that makes me so optimistic. Always been hopeful, and I feel like I'm now optimistic for near-term improvements. Is just people talking about it, like people saying, "Yeah, these rules are stupid. We have to get rid of these rules." and even within the industry, 25 years ago, people generally felt like the rules were good and they needed more rules. That were, the reason things were bad were not enough rules. And I feel like that tenor has changed. That the tone of the discussion has changed in a big way. So if someone like yourself walks into a room and starts saying, we should sort of, maybe zoning is not good, you're not going to be laughed out of the room for saying that.
Right.
So stair reform is you're working on that. That's a topic now. Are there other aspects of the building code that y'all are zeroing in on?
Yeah, more broadly, I am very interested in the process of building code development in the construction industry and in many parts of the U.S. economy. There's a huge role that's played by model codes where a nonprofit organization writes a model code, which is just their First Amendment right to publish this sort of thing. It's not public policy, but then that model code gets implemented in states and localities across the country as actual law. And that process seems to me has a lot of unaccountability because the model code developers are saying, we're just making suggestions, not public policy. And then the policymakers are saying, we're just doing the normal model code. We're not, deviating in any way. So it's like there's not this process of really rigorous consideration of building code requirements. And I think this issue of single stair reform has shone a light on the need to think more carefully about what our building codes require and how that compares to international best practices.
Yeah. I think a lot about, at least on the residential construction side, like where are you really spending money? Where are the big things you're spending money on? And one of the biggest line items is windows.
Mm-hmm.
And that's huge line, especially huge line item now for construction, and an incredibly regulated product. Like, in most areas, a really regulated product. And the justification for the enormous amount of attention given to prescriptive attention given to windows is energy efficiency and wind. Sure, you want your windows to function and want them to withstand wind forces and things like that. But something I observe, and I ran about this a lot, we're now in a position where when I began in construction as a teenager, generally windows were built locally by, certainly there are manufacturers of windows, but often windows were built locally by a local cabinet shop. And then after windows began to be regulated for energy standards and structural integrity standards, it wasn't that the cabinet makers' windows were not as efficient or as strong, but the cabinet maker didn't have enough scale to certify that his windows were. So those windows could no longer be purchased. And so then windows began to be, they were always manufactured, but then it became essentially all windows are manufactured products with parts that come from all over that are actually kind of complex. And you look at those windows and they're like a high performance piece of equipment that any tiny piece breaks and the whole you got to replace the whole window, which is very different than the windows that were being put into houses, up until the 70s and 80s. And but that's a huge line item. Window package in a house could be $50,000. And do they need to be that much? And I think probably it's maybe like the do we really need stairs to be this way for safety reasons? Like, well, there's no evidence that they need to be this way for safety reasons. And is the effort that goes into making sure that only the largest private equity owned manufacturers of windows who have a supply chain that spans the entire globe can provide windows in every house in America? Because is the work we put into doing that, is it worth it? Or maybe should we just let local carpenters build windows again? So that would be my request if you expand into a new area for something to pay attention to.
Yeah. I love that example. And I think there are so many places where individual code requirements are not a big deal on their own. But, so once you layer up all the code requirements, we might end up with plumbing systems that cost 20% more than what they might need to cost in France, or just to take a random hypothetical. And when you repeat that over every single component of a house, we're talking about big dollars.
Yeah. I wonder too how much, there's a lot of building science stuff in there that I'm definitely not a building scientist, but there's so much prescription in the building code now. And we have homes that have become so efficient, like airtight, that we get to a point of counterproductivity where if something fails in the home, then we have molded. We have all these other problems that totally destroy the home. So we spend so much energy, time, attention, and getting it to be a high performance thing that it's actually a bit like it's a little special creature that can never experience. It's fragile. It's not anti-fragile as homes used to be.
Right.
Yeah, there's so much in there. Well, so can I'm guessing I cannot, but I'm going to ask you if you can make some predictions. You've seen a lot of change over the last 7 years. When we talk again 7 years from now, we'll talk before that. When we talk again 7 years from now, where do you think we'll be?
Well, I think we'll certainly see more states continuing in the same path of legalizing things like accessory dwelling units or other types of incremental increases in density. I hope that we'll see some statewide, very strong minimum lot size bills getting passed. That's one where I'm really optimistic that this is a policy that can be done well by expanding property rights from the state level. And hopeful that that's a direction state policymakers will go. I think it's a really scalable reform that already works with a lot of U.S. financing systems and consumer preferences based on what we've seen in Houston.
Do you see, I should have asked you this a little earlier, but do you see anything happening in the Southeast, anything exciting happening here?
Yeah, Florida a couple of years ago passed what's called the Live Local Act. And this is another great case of a red state passing something that might seem like blue state legislation. It legalizes multifamily housing in a lot of parts of the state where it wasn't allowed before, oftentimes at quite dense levels. And it's paired with, I believe, tax credits that have helped make this relatively recent law have very recognizable fast effects on new housing supply.
You see anything in Georgia, North Carolina, or South Carolina?
Let's see. North Carolina, I believe, is looking at or has perhaps passed a building code reform that would allow up to 4 units to be built under the International Residential Code, which is typically in most of the U.S., more than 2 units means a move to the International Building Code, which is a lot more expensive to build to in a lot of different dimensions. Apologies if I'm getting the details there wrong.
Those would be things like, fire doors and corridors of a certain width, doors of a certain width, and sprinkler systems, and like things that you would expect in a really, really big building.
Yes.
Not a little quadruplex or a little 4-unit apartment.
Exactly. And this is an example of a building code that pairs very naturally with some of the state and local reforms that we've been seeing to try to make it possible to build more duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes.
Well, I hope we're going to see more things like that. I do find it endlessly annoying that self-professed conservatives in the South are not totally championing property rights. But I am heartened to see it happening in other places, liberal and conservative. It seems like it does feel like we're on, we're still at the beginning, and a lot of it is still rhetoric right now, but it's making its way into policy. And then we're seeing some actual impact on real humans following those reforms just a few years later. It's really exciting.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Hope to see much more of that impact on real humans in the years to come. Yeah.
Well, Emily, I always love seeing you. Thank you for chatting with me here on Yeoman. Oh, and I should let people know where to find you. You're EBW Hamilton, right? So on both Blue Sky and X, is that right?
Yes, mostly on Blue Sky these days.
Y'all have been trying to pull me over there for a few
Yeah.
And also you can find your writings at the Mercatus website. It's very easy to find Emily Hamilton, and you'll see your stuff.
Yep.
Thank you so much for chatting with me.
Thank you, Geoff. Always great to get to talk to you.
Yes, likewise. Bye-bye.
Bye.